In 1908, the Singer Building in New York became the tallest building in the world at 205 meters. Designed by architect Ernest Flagg, it was built in the Beaux Arts style, a French architectural style that prided itself on symmetry and references to classical styles involving columns, statues, and high ceilings. The facade was made out of red brick, light-colored stone and terracotta, with the top of the tower containing a 15-meter tall dome covering the top 3 stories. It was a marvel of construction when it was built, but it wasn't very practical. Its narrow tower made it lack office space, and it wasn't very profitable, especially compared to other, larger styles of skyscraper that were built after it. The Daily News said that the Singer Building fell victim to a malady called progress, and in 1967 it was torn down, the largest building in history to ever be peacefully demolished. But what if that story isn't true? What if the real story is that the Singer Building was a relic from an ancient empire, and that its destruction was actually part of a coordinated global and ongoing campaign to lie to humanity about our true history?
We're expected to believe that they built things like this with a hammer and a chisel.
History wants us to believe that people that rode around in horse and buggies built all of this.
The idea that the Singer Building was built by an ancient empire who used to control the world is part of a conspiracy theory known online as the Mud Flood Theory, or more simply, Tartaria. The theory states that the entire world used to be under the dominance of an Asian European empire called Great Tartaria, or Great Tartary, depending on who you ask, who have wielded great technology and built the wonders of the world, operated energy weapons, and may actually have been led by giants.
Giants from the Tartarian civilization around the 1800s.
This empire had its own architectural style, but advanced technology that they could use to extract free energy from the ether, a technology that has since been lost. Because according to this theory, this empire fell between 300 and 100 years ago. How it fell is a bit unclear. People don't really have the answers to everything here, because the new empires, modern day Russia, China, the UK and the US, have hidden all traces of this ancient world-spanning civilization. They want you to believe that it never actually existed. The main theory of how it fell, though, is that someone or something caused a mud flood that embedded most of the world and most cities under several feet of mud, burying much of the architecture of the Tartarian Empire. This is known as the Great Reset. Humanity had lived in a golden era for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, until this reset. And the world we're living in today, which is most of the modern world and modern history, is actually living in the post-apocalyptic dystopia in the fall of that empire. And this mud flood is of course the reason why it's called the mud flood theory, but it's also the most prominent theory because apparently there's a lot of evidence of it. When you excavate cities, you oftentimes find things underground, buildings and windows and doors that seem to indicate that ground level used to be significantly lower than it is today. And think about all the architecture that you're seeing today. How come all the pretty ornate buildings were all built 200 years ago? And today, everything's just built with concrete and glass. And even though we still have some of the buildings from Tartaria around today, what we're actually seeing is only the top of much larger structures, the bulk of which are underground, buried by the mud flood.
Then it was completely erased from the history books and rewritten in order to hide us from the truth. We were told that these were built by people that rode in horse and buggies. We're expected to believe that they built things like this with a hammer and a chisel.
So, obviously, this conspiracy theory is not true. It goes against everything we know about history and has seemingly formed from nothing. And there are also some similarities to other conspiracy theories, such as the ancient aliens built the pyramids, because there's an assumption that the ancient peoples simply didn't have the skills or the knowledge to construct the vast constructions that they did. How come they could build such ornate, beautiful buildings, but seemingly we can't? People keep saying we could build ornate cathedrals and monuments to greatness, but we never really do. It's always just glass and concrete. Looking on the typical forums, it doesn't look as if it's a very popular theory, but on TikTok, a place where anyone can say anything with no consequence, it's become extremely popular.
The lost empire of Tartaria. As you can see, it's depicted in many old maps. During this time period, all of these amazing structures were built. It was a unified civilization with advanced technology, and they mastered the ability to have free energy for the entire city. And yet history wants us to believe that people that rode around in horse and buggies built all of this.
This theory is interesting to me because usually conspiracy theories take a known historical event or concept and twist it for their own use. And that is what's happening here. But when you look at it on the surface level, it doesn't seem like it. Talking about a vast steppe empire based in northern China or southeast Russia? Sure, yeah, maybe the Mongol Empire, but we know of that. But there's no indication that the Mongol Empire would have fallen just 300 years ago. So what's the deal here? To answer that, we should start where most people get drawn into the theory. The idea of an ancient empire in Asia that you can see on old maps. So, let's talk about European cartography. Maps! Did you know that for a significant part of human history, maps were nowhere near as accurate as they are today? Most cartographers had to rely on the words of older maps and explorers and traders and things of that nature. And as maps were made and cartographers and explorers verified older maps, the maps would be continuously refined over time. But accurate mapping oftentimes had to do with things that were important to the cartographers. Namely, knowing how big your kingdom is, or figuring out the most efficient way to trade. This is where the vast majority of explorers come in, because they're less exploring for the sense of adventure, and more surveyors to figure out the best place to get from here to here. Because this place has bland food, this place has good food. So we took all of their spices and didn't manage to make better food anyway. So in some areas, maps could be incredibly detailed. Heavy trade routes, for example, ways in and out of ports. Maps there could be very detailed and refined. But other parts of the map were often just we don't know what's there, there's probably nothing important there. These areas are often less known to cartographers, and why wouldn't they be? If there's nothing there, and there's nothing valuable coming from there, why do you spend money on an explorer to go in there and map out the area? There's nothing there anyway. And so in some areas, maps could just be good enough. You didn't need complete accuracy of where things were in relation to each other. You just needed like, yeah, this area is that area. Who gives a shit? It's an area, there's something there. Or I guess they would say it with a British accent, so more in the sense of like, "Call blimey, chaps! There's a bug over there. Call blimey, chaps! This whole region we shall call India." Yes. And so sometimes, some areas of the map were often just good enough. Not accurate necessarily for trading or to reality, but good enough for the purposes of the map. Take, for example, the area north of Mongolia, or I guess including modern day Mongolia, this general sort of area. I couldn't find a pen good enough. This area was rarely important for European cartographers. There are not a ton of natural resources that Europeans could use, and even when it comes to Chinese and Russian conquerors, this area just vibes. Historically, Historically, this area has had a lot of important things going on in it, don't get me wrong, but cartographers have oftentimes just not had an interest in mapping this area out. It was simply a land of people to conquer, with no natural resources and no major trade routes going through it. The first Western explorer to actually try to get into this area, to try to bring information back to Europe, was a man called Giovanni di Pian del Carpine. Mamma mia. He was on a mission from the Pope to try to figure out what's the deal? What's the deal with the Mongol Empire? He's on a mission to find out how many are there, how's their political structures, who's in charge, what resources, what trade do they offer, why can't I ever win over them in freaking Crusader Kings 3? Now he traveled from Rome all the way through modern-day Ukraine to the edge of Mongol territory, and then onward through Mongol territory, and trying to find the emperor, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. In Mongol territory, he eventually meets the great Khan Göyük and tells him, hey, do you want to be Christian? And he says, no. In fact, he actually tells Giovanni eventually, hey, you should go back to Rome and tell the Pope to come over here and he can pledge his fealty to me instead. Giovanni eventually makes his way back to Europe and he compiles all the information from his exploration into a report which he calls Historia Magnolorum, the history of the Mongols. But the full title is actually Ursa Historia cum nos Tartarus appellelum. Tartarus appellamus. Or History of the Mongols, which we call Tatars. Since this report, this area became cemented as being Tartar. But you can tell from the title that he didn't come up with the name Tartar. He just uses it because that's what already was used at the time. So why is that? Well, the word Tartar is actually not necessarily derived... What am I doing with this? Now, the word Tartar doesn't actually relate to the modern-day ethnic group of Tatars. That's a different thing that sort of derived afterwards due to, you know, culture shifting and things happening after the fall of the Mongol Empire. It's not relevant here, actually. But the point is, we're talking about European place names, not the ethnic group. Important. Now, the word Tatar probably entered European language from either Turkic or Persian languages, from the word Tatar, meaning mounted messenger. And it was used primarily in relation to the Mongol Empire as it spread from here before Giovanni's travels onwards into Europe, becoming one of the greatest empires that the world had ever seen. And as it spread, people would oftentimes first be meted by a mounted warrior from the Mongol Empire, demanding their surrender or, you know, complete annihilation. And because Europeans were scared shitless of the Mongol onslaught, they added the R from Tatar, which means mounted warrior, to make a reference to Tartarus, Greek hell. The idea being that the Mongol onslaughts were like hell incarnate on Earth. It's a pun. And it's because of this pun that this whole region of the world was known to European cartographers as Tartaria, the land where, you know, the mounted warriors came from. Hell on Earth. And this isn't unique in history either. The ancient Greeks, these boys, would oftentimes refer to the entire area of Europe as Scythians. Now, the Scythians were actually a real ethnic group, but they didn't survive for a super long time. But that doesn't matter, because any nomadic group from Europe would be called Scythians. Even though there are different languages, ethnic groups, things like that. And this isn't a rare or unusual phenomenon. It still happens today. Just think of the way that we refer to the various thousands, various ethnic groups and languages that exist just in indigenous North America. American Indians. And to be clear here, this good enough attitude around Tartary is only good enough for European cartographers. The people who lived there and the people who have lived around that area know about the nuance. And so it's not a testament of some hidden former empire in the region. It's the evidence of European laziness. But what does all of this have to do with Great Tartaria? Well, the theory of Great Tartaria is that this was actually a vast empire. That Tartaria was not actually some sort of good enough name to just lump a bunch of people in together. It was actually the real empire. And it survives today by people looking at older European maps that do reference this as Tartary or Tartaria, as evidence in itself. But that's not where the theory actually finds its origin. In fact, the origin goes back to a man called Anatolio Fomenko. Now, Fomenko has his own theories about the history of the world. He is the creator of the theory known as New Chronology, which I've made a video digging in a bit more detail to previously. So if you want details about that specifically, you'll have to go there. But he has ideas that the moon doesn't make full sense with modern day chronology, and that Russia used to dominate the entire Eurasian continent, that they would send explorers to the New World and colonize the Russian empires of the Maya and the Aztec. And that theory focuses a lot on most of Eurasia actually being a historic part of the Great Russian Horde. And it's an ethno-nationalist conspiracy theory in order to justify the Russian dominance over all of its territorial neighbors. But Tartaria is not about Russia. And many people who believe in Tartaria believe that Russia is a puppet state by them, or that they are, in fact, the secret controllers behind everything, that they stole the throne from Tartaria, that they took their seat, and they are now pretending to be the real rulers of Asia. And it's all based on this reference picture showing a bunch of different flags from various nations. And Tartaria does have its own flag. And this might raise some eyebrows, especially when you consider the fact that the Russian imperial flag depicts the Tartarian flag within it. So maybe this is a sign of them hiding in plain sight. And this is where we're getting the origins of the mud flood theory as an offshoot of New Chronology. Specifically created by a man called Nikolai Levashov, who is a Russian occultist and spiritual healer, which I just personally love that. Now, he is also a Russian propagandist, much like Fomenko, but he has even more out there theories. He lays out these theories in the book Russian History Viewed Through Distorted Mirrors. The book came out in 2007 and was actually eventually banned for reasons that will become obvious very quickly. The books claim a fair number of things, and is about as easy to read as you might expect from a man who seemingly wants to create the strangest theory of the world to ever exist. Take, for example, the origin of white people. As a result of Star Wars between light and dark forces, one moon, Layla, went off its orbit, and its splinter Svarogesies fell on the Earth, causing a planetary catastrophe. The tectonic plates were displaced, and Diaria sank into the Arctic Ocean. Undoubtedly, this continent did exist, and was an ancient motherland of the white race. Sure, undoubtedly. He also claims that Christianity has been forced on white people in order to delude us from the truth. It gradually did its dirty business. The descendants of the white race forgot the true concepts and traditions of millennia and had only the distorted ideas imposed by the Israelites. War, being financed by Judaic money, had become an everyday occurrence long ago. This war was a key event. It lasted for almost 4 years, from 1772 to 1775. After the Slavonic Aryan Empire, which is what he calls the Tartarian Empire, was defeated, the whole history of modern humanity was rewritten. It was completely fabricated according to the Israelites' wishes and criteria. Oh, so typically, he's blaming the Jews. The Jews, as always, are to blame for every conspiracy theory, apparently. Now, this book is obviously complete nonsense, but it demonstrates a clear similarity with the overall theory of Tartaria, but with some differences. He claims that Russia defeated Tartaria in a war, which is definitely part of the modern Tartaria theory, but he makes no mention of mud floods. He mentions that Russia did topple the ancient empire, but makes no mention to them having advanced architecture or free energy generators. He actually talks a lot more about stargates, which isn't part of the theory, but I really wish it would have been. So what the modern theory ends up being is a muddled and mixed version of Levashev's version of new chronology, with elements that Levashev attributes to specific events and peoples being applied to possibly everything. But this is where we start to separate the theory more and more from its Russian roots. And today, Tartaria believers are basically not at all aligned with Russia or Russian interests, or believing that Russia is supposedly this ancient empire. And one person that I think has exemplified this split from Russia is a man called David Ewing Jr. And he's written a bunch of books about Tartaria, but my favorite is his one about Tartaria and transvestigation, arguing that the ancient world was more advanced, and perhaps the people who have brought down this ancient empire is secret trans people. More on that in my last video, I guess. But the majority of the focus in David's books has to do with architecture. A big focus for Tartaria believers deals with submerged buildings, or world fairs, because they depict extraordinary buildings that just aren't around anymore. World fairs are actually very common points of argument within the community, as are star forts, with the claim that the ancient peoples just couldn't have made such symmetrical structures by themselves. But when you lay it all out in front of you, like David does in his books, it all just devolves into a pseudoscientific nonsense fest with absolutely no justification whatsoever. For example, a big question researchers asked was, the Easter Island heads, the statues are buried. What happened? How did they get buried? Which researchers? There are many photos showing work being done at Stonehenge. Researchers show these photos as clear evidence that Stonehenge was built recently. David, you know not everything in a single picture is the same age, right? I also love that these pictures aren't even screenshots. He just took pictures of them with his phone on his monitor and just put them in a book. Like, fuck it, it'll do, I guess. But while David is funny, his focus on architecture is something that's shared by many within the Tartaria community. The overwhelming amount of evidence are images of old buildings or sometimes entire cities looking weird. A common refrain within the community are people being confused over how people who rode horse and buggies could have built things like cathedrals.
We were told that these were built by people that rode in horse and buggies.
Similar confusion exists over cities that look empty or where shacks would be pictured next to huge skyscrapers. The contrast of technology and wealth are just too much for some people to make sense of in their minds.
And I know what you're gonna say. Oh, they were poor. They couldn't afford to build stuff like that for themselves. Yet, look at this neighborhood. They couldn't build this for themselves. These are some pretty damn nice houses. I just refuse to believe that these people built this.
These are all aesthetic issues, and that is as deep as most believers will admit to being. And unless you examine it, you might actually agree. So, let's actually examine it. As always, everything is political, everything political is online, and everything online is Marxist economics. Ignoring any evidence, which is quite easy for a lot of these people to do, you actually do see a deep frustration with how our society is organized. We have multi-billionaires running around at the same time as homeless people exist. So something's wrong. They notice, they see this as a flaw in how our society is structured. And they correctly also see that the reason why it's structured like this is because society is ruled by the people who have the most money. But to them that doesn't make sense. There's no natural evolution for how we got there and how it has ended up to our cities becoming blocky Minecraft cubes with no visual aesthetic of themselves. And critically, they don't see how our society today was formed into the way that it is. It displays a misunderstanding of history that goes beyond the aesthetic, even though that is where it often ends up for them. The focus on aesthetics and architecture is only really symbolic. The real concern is a frustration with society in which we live. But many of the people don't have the tools or words or knowledge required to sort of understand why this has happened. You can enroll some of these people in a history course and you can tell them how money accumulates over time and the toppling of the aristocracy leads to the establishment of a bourgeois class, but most people never reach that level. Most people just look at how things appeared in history and how they appear today. But not only is it a reflection of our modern day concerns around cities, I think it's also a reflection of how we think about the climate right now. A major part of the theory has to do with the free energy, with the technological advancement. And some people argue that, well, we've had an industrial revolution for quite a long time. Humanity has been here for such a long time. How come we still haven't figured out how to take care of the planet? The only explanation that some people have is that, well, they are forcing us to live in a system where we have to pay for power. Back in the day, they argue, we could produce infinite free energy, clean energy that we could harvest from the ether. And I get why that's something that you would want to strive for and idealize. Especially with recent events causing, gas prices to go up way higher than people are used to, causing electric bills to become way more expensive than most people can actually handle. I mean, who wouldn't want to fantasize about free energy generators that you could just stick on your roof? Any ornate roof ornament is going to be assumed to be some sort of energy generator. Cathedrals are especially subject to this because they have a lot of roof ornaments, and, well, I'll just let TikTok take the lead on this one too.
A cavity magnetron is a high-powered vacuum tube that generates microwaves using the interaction of a stream of ions with a magnetic field while in the cavity resonator. Can you see the resemblance? These structures were never intended to hold glass within them.
But all of this is just vague science words smushed together. They never explain why it would generate energy, just that cavity magnetrons generate energy.
Now, if you haven't heard of cymatics, it's basically the study of sound and frequency waves in their visible form. I just find it extremely coincidental that a lot, if not all of these buildings have structures that represent certain frequencies in their visible form. And didn't a lot of these buildings have bells in them?
Bells? Yeah, but what do bells have to do with anything?
All around the world we see the remnants of our ancestors hiding in plain sight. These buildings look more like a fairy tale than real life, and most are long destroyed, only remembered in pictures.
And this is where they turn to the evidence regarding petrochemical billionaires, because they argue that climate change is a result of the fall of Tartaria. Because we don't have this free energy anymore, that's why the world is becoming as bad as it is. So they look to history and they see that a lot of petrochemical billionaires and companies and climate scientists sponsored by petrochemical billionaires have done an active effort to hide research into climate change. All companies themselves have known about climate change since the 50s and 60s, but climate change as a concept has been known to scientists since 1900. And if you really view the world through a purely technological lens, this doesn't make any sense. Especially since there are clean energy alternatives and there are ways to fix climate change. But because we don't, they are doing it. And you can see this frustration when people talk about the vast amounts of wealth coming from oil and coal. Sure, we can build great cities and great monuments to ourselves, but they don't really compare to that built in the past. And the world is getting worse still. How come everything in the past appears as a golden age, but today, with more technology than ever, it's a dystopia?
These buildings were used for harnessing the ether and converting it into free energy. Their boats ran off free energy. The columns were electric, and the cathedral domes and towers were power stations for transmission of clean, free, and wireless energy. Later on, the parasites put crosses and other religious symbols to conceal the original purpose.
Now, one big reason for why things look aesthetically different is because there have been different priorities across history for how we build buildings, and also a great deal of survivor bias. We today don't see the myriad of shacks and sheds that most people would build in and live in. We only see the great spires and monuments that they built, that they dedicated specific energy into to becoming aesthetically pleasing. And that's one reason. But it still doesn't answer the question of why we aren't building ornate structures like that today. Where are the great cathedrals? And where are the great structures of stone? And this is where economics comes in, because construction has changed radically, specifically on its return on investment. I don't know why anyone watches my videos. I welcome 100,000 people to me talking about concrete economics. Construction as an industry has been around since civilization, and for most of human history there have been two rules around construction. Construction material is expensive, but labor is cheap. Labor has historically been cheap because you didn't oftentimes need to pay anyone above subsistence wage, as in you give someone a piece of bread and then they work for a few days. It's pretty cheap to maintain that, especially if you're a rich person who wants to commission a grand cathedral in your name or something like that. Conversely, construction material is expensive. It demands a lot of technology to extract and refine and to transport. Things that aren't very easy before the invention of trucks. And so the thing that people in the past would dedicate their time to was refining those construction materials as finely as possible in order to extract the maximum return of investment. And this was worth it for a lot of investors because they would get a high return on investment without investing too much into the cost of labor of actually refining that material. But since the Industrial Revolution, two things have happened. One, new technologies have made it so that construction materials are a lot cheaper. We have concrete, we have trucks that move gravel around, we have steel that you can easily build high structures with. But conversely, labor has become more expensive. Workers now need living wages, housing, safety equipment, training. Those things cost money, and suddenly the cost of labor and actually investing time into a building becomes more costly and less worth it. Suddenly, you're not going to pay construction workers to refine the terracotta on a building when you can just put up a concrete wall. And this shift in economics has actually exacerbated that survivorship bias because a lot of older buildings were built to basically last forever in order to maximize the return on investment on that construction material. But today, buildings are built to last a little bit until they made their money back, and then you can tear them down and just build up a new one. This is what happened to the Singer building, which despite its beauty and style and alleged energy generator just wasn't making enough money compared to other skyscrapers, like One Liberty Plaza. It's also what happened with world fairs. Buildings were built very beautifully and very quickly, but that meant that the quality of the construction was dog shit in order to keep costs down. And they had to be temporary constructions. So this is why cities look the way that they do. But you can explain this to a lot of believers in this theory and they're not going to listen to you. A lot of people who believe in this are not actually tradesmen themselves. They're not construction workers, they're not architects, they're opinion havers on Reddit, which is a fine thing to be, but they're not oftentimes invested in how cities are actually built. But even if you explain this to someone, and even if they know how buildings are built, and even if they understand Marxist economics, and all of that stuff, some people still won't believe you, because they have evidence. So let's dig into that evidence. The number one example that people will bring up is the revealing of cities underneath the ground, which I've mentioned previously in this video. And they will demonstrate pictures like this, which can look pretty convincing on first glance. That looks like windows and doors underneath ground level, several stories, and why would anyone actually build that? But the thing is, they're not actually windows and doors, they just look like they are. These are foundations or fundaments that people will build underneath buildings so that they don't move around when the ground moves. It's actually quite important. You need to have a big foundation so that the building will stand for a long time. But most people never see a foundation. And if you don't know anything about foundations, odds are you might just think of foundations as a big concrete block that you put in the ground. Like Minecraft. But that's not actually how it works. It needs to be kind of porous, for lack of a better term, because you need to put in cables, you need to put in pipes, plumbing, sewers, all sorts of things need to go through that thing. Sometimes they can be underneath the foundations, and that's fine, but oftentimes they're just in the foundations themselves. So pictures like this don't actually make that much sense. But then they show pictures like this. But these aren't foundations, these aren't fundaments. These are actually former ground floors. These are actually windows, and that's true. And this brings us to actual flooding. Floodings that have actually happened. I don't know if you actually know this, but many cities throughout the world are located near water. Sometimes that water goes up, as in times during storms or other events. Water go up events. This causes flooding. The water goes through the streets and damages property and housing. And it's not good. People generally don't want flooding, and it's a problem that's getting worse in the modern day. Now, there are a few ways to fix flooding. One of them is to fix climate change and to stabilize the entire Earth weather. Not gonna happen. The other method is to build flood walls or dikes or other types of walls against the water. But this can actually be not practical in a lot of situations. Sometimes a dike is going to leak a lot and it's going to be a present danger for a long time in case the dike breaks. Not good. Sometimes the ground might not be stable enough for a wall. So, okay, sucks, I guess. I guess we have to deal with flooding. Unless you go for method number 3, which is simply to raise the entire ground level upwards. Water doesn't flow upwards, so you can outsmart the water. And this is something that a lot of cities have actually intentionally done. They've buried entire streets, sometimes up to 3 floors high, just to intentionally raise the ground level, so that when there is a flood, the water isn't going to flow there. A lot of cities have done this in like more or less severity, but the one that a lot of people will send pictures of is a place in Seattle, because Seattle did that, and now they're hosting tours in the ruins underneath the ground, with skylights where the new ground level is. And on the new ground level, you have, you know, roads, pedestrian streets, signs, you know, normal ground level shit. And this isn't something new, this is something that ancient peoples also did in their ancient cities, which sometimes will lead to archaeological digs in modern cities built in old cities, discovering former bottom floors that are actually just buried and forgotten about intentionally hundreds of years ago. And when this doesn't happen, sometimes there are actual mud floods. The river Tiber in Italy has regularly flooded and caused a lot of cities to be buried under a fair amount of ground, essentially. But these floods wouldn't happen to the level of covering entire civilizations. It would cover up a part of the town. And what would happen is people would simply rebuild their town on top of the ruins of their old town. Because, of course, it's practical. Which again leads to a similar phenomenon where you dig underground and you find a new town. None of this is evidence of a mud flood, but it's simply evidence of how cities are built and maintained. But the thing is, these things don't really happen today. People don't really raise the ground levels of their cities or build on top of ruins when a mud flood comes through, because we've gotten better at protecting our cities and where we live. When people think flood control, they think of dams, and they don't think of things that might actually explain what's going on. In addition to this, they also talk about domes as being Tartarian architecture, saying that because a type of ringed dome is common in a lot of different places around the world, built by different people, this is a sign that the same people actually built all of them. It is unrealistic for people to have come up with the exact same style of dome in many different areas of the world. Which again kind of betrays the lack of awareness and skill that these people actually have when analyzing their theory. A lot of the time it's down to economics or mathematics, and that's kind of easy for most people to figure out. The most egregious example of this are probably Tartaria hardcore believers who believe that pyramids all over the world were built by the same people, because why are there pyramids everywhere? I mean, the simple explanation is that that's how you build a building that stands around for a long time. Anyone who's ever played with blocks as a child can figure that out. You don't need advanced technology to figure that out, bucko. And all of this sounds like pretty reasonable answers to the evidence that is purported by the theorists. Except for some. Take, for example, some of the evidence that they use that doesn't have to do with images, such as CIA documents and other real examples of falsifications of history. One piece of evidence that they often use comes from the CIA, but it's actually a report of something that the Soviets were doing in their homeland during the Cold War. So this document deals with that falsification of history, and it mentions Tartaria by name. So it says, or let us take the matter of history, which, along with religion, language, and literature, constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on August 9th, 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the fact of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians on orders of the Communist Party have rewritten history to distort the facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. This document, you will understand, isn't actually about Tartaria the empire, but Tartaria, the generic name for a complete geographic area and ethnic group. Just like medieval cartographers, the Soviets and the CIA, probably more specifically, are using generic terms for a generic area because they're lazy. But if you don't know the history of the word Tartar, it seems kind of obvious, right? It all fits into the general mold of the theory as it stands anyway. And this is a point where a lot of believers will point out that, well, it makes sense if you only read it within the context of everything else also making sense. Which is how a conspiracy theory works. It is upholding itself. But all of this is mostly just set dressing for an ideological phenomenon that is a bit more insidious and that has some political connotations with real-world consequences. And that is a phenomenon that's called aesthetic moralism. Aesthetic moralism is the idea that some aesthetics, especially in architecture, are more inherently good than other styles of architecture. Sometimes this depends on the way that you value good. If you're talking about pure value, some people will value brutalism more than others. Some people on the left will sometimes do this, where they see brutalist architecture being built very cheaply, and they will see that as having the maximum utilitarian value. And therefore, it is good because you can solve the housing crisis by building a lot of blocks, very in Soviet style. Which is fine, But a lot of people will base the value not on utilitarian value, but rather on moral good. It's just better this way. Obsession around architecture is something that isn't actually uncommon, especially when it comes to right-wing political movements. Architectural styles can act as a shorthand for how things appear to be going. If a city is ugly, you know, it's not going to go well for it. But if a city is pretty, oh, then you know you've reached success. A lot of extremist right-wing ideologies have had a fascination and obsession with architecture for that specific reason. But the aesthetics also support the ideology at play. To be fair, it's not just right-wing ideologies that do this, but right-wing ideologies do have an obsession with the past. But there is such a thing as left-wing architecture as well, building more modern and innovative buildings that don't look at all like the buildings of the past. Both of them symbolize a message to put forward. A clear example of this happens in the 1937 World Fair in Paris that displays both the national pavilions of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union pavilion displays the classical union of workers and peasants, but the Nazi pavilion is built to symbolize Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism. Purely via architectural style, the political ideas of both nations are represented. And I think that this obsession with architecture displays the ideological underpinnings of Tartaria as well. Because when asked who is to blame for all of society's ills, oftentimes the people pointed out will be generalized parasites or the Jews, both theories that are extremely congruent with 20th century fascist theory. And that's not surprising considering that these ideas originate with Levashov's work that is extremely far-right, bordering on Nazi occultism. And this is where the danger comes in with Tartaria. Tartaria is strange, because on one hand, these people do desperately want to return to the great empire, but they also are frustrated with the way that modern-day politics works. And this points, I think, to the most fundamental core of their ideology. It's not necessarily a right-wing or a left-wing frustration with the world, although there are some people who, of course, do subscribe to those ideologies here as well. But I don't think Tartaria is inherently either one. Rather, I think that the believers of Tartaria want an alternative. They see historical architecture as maybe being preferable, but at the same time, not all historical buildings are acceptable. Only the more spectacular ones. They want to return to that idyllic past, but they want to return to the outrageous idyllic past. So while a lot of aspects of this ideology are right-wing focused, it's also a frustration with the modern right wing. They don't believe that the modern right wing has the solutions available to fix the problems. They don't look up to Russia, they do not look up to people like Donald Trump, because they are simply puppets of them. Many will sometimes speculate around the Mongol Empire, thinking that it may have been Tartaria, but only if Genghis Khan was a blonde white man. Or sometimes arguing that the giants that ruled Tartaria are our white ancestors. And like I'm 2 meters tall, but I'm not that tall. And this is where I think the frustration with modern day right-wing ideology comes in. Because they don't only want to rebuild the past, they want to make an entirely new past that is better than anything that has existed before. They want to return to an empire that no longer exists. And to do that, they need to build it anew. Hi everyone, welcome to the end of the video. I want to quickly mention my sponsor for this video, CuriosityStream. You know CuriosityStream, they are the people who keep sponsoring my videos even though I'm really bad at meeting their deadlines. Thank you. And they're also a streaming service that has thousands of documentaries with all sorts of documentaries about basically whatever you can think of. If you're interested more in conspiracy theories and myths and things of that nature, I highly recommend the I forgot what it's called. Secret societies that deals into the history of the Templars, the Illuminati, and things like that. And if you're interested in watching more educational topics in general, I highly recommend Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that me and a bunch of other YouTubers have gone on to have a streaming platform that is separate from YouTube, where we don't have to worry about the algorithm. You can find my videos there, and you can also find the content of a bunch of other creators, including some videos you can only get on Nebula. And if you like my content, I'm sure you're gonna like basically everyone else who's there as well. And if you use the link in my description, you get access to both Nebula and CuriosityStream together as a bundle deal for less than $15 per year. So if you like that, do that. And remember that this whole thing isn't real. Hi, and thank you for watching the video. That is going to be the end of my conspiracy theory YouTube series that I've been doing for a little bit. I'm gonna start going back to do more classical me and Mulder content, or whatever we end up doing. I want to give a special thanks to everyone who's watching this video still now, and a special thanks to all of my patrons who allow me to do this as a job and who, support me doing this stuff. If you like my work and you want to support it financially, I'd like it if you go to my Patreon, because obviously I like it. If you want to hear more content, you should also look into Leechfest, which is the medical history podcast that I do, which is good. I like that one too. And I also want to give a special thanks to Aini Salminen, Aislinn, Alicia Crawford, Alibat, Amanda B, Amara, Amelia Unchained, Amy Lee, Andy Sophia Fontaine, Andre Cabrera, Angelo Garcia, Ashley K, Aster Disaster, Athiet, Catherine Stenson, Choices Make Me Anxious, Christine Gutierrez, Cobra Sphere, Dana Ferguson, D. Mirandi Arisetto, Eleanor Cassidy, Emilia Clark, Emily Pinkies, Erich Owens, Erin Rafferty, Fox E, Fox Kant, Gwenda Euphoria, Henry R. Seymour, Jane Lusby, Janelle Torgesson, Jareth Arnold, Jane the Human, Jill Isabel Gary, Jörgen, Joshua Anlick, Julia Helene, Justin Lowry, Kiera Wins IRL, LPQ Silver, Lennart Chavaz, Lucas Gray, Madison Jacob, Marcus Smith, Mari Neckar, Maurizio, Michaela, McCoy, Mo Khalifa, Mod Zero, Nicholas Kapoor, Njofbun, Orion Gamercat, Pavel Dubek, Pin 3D, Remy, Rob Howlett, Rose Brunton, Sasa Chu, Sean, no more no less, Shelby Von Trapp, Sitzrees, Sonic Bread, Stephanie Sterling, Talia Parkinson, Taylor Sophia, Thea Vega, Thoros of Mir, Travis Siobhan, Tulips, Tyr, Violet Tsukas Harrison, Vivian Crow, and Wolfgang, the Grand High Exalted Wizard. Thank you.